You know I love him. I just wish he was better. I know he can be.
Thanks to a mysterious bit of magic, Kratos overhears his son whispering these final words to his late mother. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the developers of the new God of War saying the same. God of War is an interesting beast. As a series, it feels firmly rooted among gaming history's icons, standing in for all the adolescent, hyper-violent tendencies that outside moral crusaders have always imagined of the medium as a whole. Kratos, the protagonist and titular God of War, spends the original trilogy and spin-off titles on a gory revenge spree. By God of War 3, it left behind him not only the bodies of all the gods who wronged him, but potentially of the entire human race. He's an embodiment of a toxic, unrestrained masculine fantasy so potent you'd expect he'd have to be self-satire. But there's rarely even a hint of irony in those games as he rips heads from bodies, murders bystanders to achieve his goals, and, perhaps most infamously, jams the X button to engage in a cartoonish approximation of sex with the blank, eager women he happens to keep encountering mid-genocide. During the last console generation, we saw more and more blockbuster game series trying to take a mature turn into more grown-up, or at least more cinematic, storytelling. At that time, it was hard to imagine where God of War could go next. Again, God of War 3 concluded with Kratos beating his own father Zeus's head to a bloody pulp, the finishing touch on the end of the world as he knew it. Meanwhile, as largely male big studio developers aged and became fathers themselves, contemporary titles like The Last of Us were taking the old, masculine, hyper-violent game protagonist archetype and asking what would happen if he found himself faced with parenthood. It was a clever bargain in a way. Characters like Joel, a self-centered asshole himself, could still slaughter their way through hundreds of monsters and villains, but they would do it out of a desire to protect a kid, and along the way maybe be confronted with their own inner demons in that child's eyes. It's a stretch to call that self-reflection, but last generation's dadification of games, as Patrick Klepek calls it, at least seemed to represent a step toward self-awareness. Enter 2018's God of War. Rather than rebooting the series, Sony opted for a direct sequel. We jump hundreds of years forward to find Kratos gruffly instructing his son Atreus, or Boy, as Kratos most often refers to him, on the construction of a funeral pyre for their wife and mother, Faye. Faye's final wish was that Kratos and Atreus travel to the peak of the highest mountain in the realms to scatter her ashes. A difficult if straightforward request that is immediately complicated by the arrival of some murderously angry Norse gods. A distant Kratos must teach his son to survive in this cruel post-apocalyptic world, but of course, it's his son that teaches him what it really means to be a father. It's cliched, sure. Games have been pulling that structure straight from Cormac McCarthy's The Road for the better part of a decade now, but there's something fundamentally strange in taking an existing character like Kratos, with a whole history as an over-the-top murderous nihilist out of edgelord dreams, and offering him a chance at humanity. You can ask, as Klepek does, whether that's a chance that needs to be offered in the first place. Of all the stories that could be told today, in the world we live in, do we really need one about the slow emotional growth of a mythic history's greatest monster? Is the redemption of a misogynist and a genocide really an arc worth dedicating tens of hours of our time to as players? Whether or not it's a story worth telling, God of War tells it shockingly well. When I sat down with this sad murder dad simulator, I had zero expectations that I would be touched in any way by the game's efforts to humanize the demigod. I can't say those expectations were exactly subverted. Kratos, by and large, has softened his edges, but remains an emotionally stunted, raging asshole and a terrible father at the game's outset. He spends the bulk of the story shouting gruff, often monosyllabic instructions and criticisms at his son, which Atreus responds to with an irrepressible, Leave-It-to-Beaver-esque enthusiasm and glee. What I did not expect was to take so much joy in these exchanges. For all that it's a blast to play, there were two aspects of God of War that took me by surprise in some way. Its beauty and its banter. Now, the first of these might seem a little silly of me. After all, the original God of War games were heralded for their spectacle, the titanic battles and impossible fantasy landscapes. But for all the larger-than-life set pieces of those original titles, they only rarely inspired a sense of awe in me. Maybe that had something to do with the speed at which Kratos rampages through their halls and tears apart the world around him. There was rarely any time to breathe and take it in, or to appreciate it for anything but an object of inevitable destruction. Maybe it was Kratos' own cavalier attitude toward everything that made it difficult to appreciate what the designers had created. Anyway, it's not as though games managed to inspire me with their 3D worlds all that often. An Orlando of Dark Souls was probably the last time I stopped and gasped at a locale or felt anything like the sublime from a set piece. The new God of War inspires that feeling constantly. It's not necessarily the sheer scale or grandeur, especially since the pathing you're allowed to travel can be so artificially confined by a frustrating lack of interactivity. But there's something about riding the Bifrost Stargate into Alfheim and pushing a boat out onto that Twilight Fairy Lake. It brings me back to the moment of scaling my first boss in Shadow of the Colossus. That heady, oh right, video games can let us do anything, let us go anywhere sensation that so many of us as kids felt stepping out into Hyrule Field. In God of War's case, that feeling is communicated entirely through flash and spectacle, and your means of interacting with these imaginative worlds is mostly limited to solving the same set of gearbox puzzles repeatedly, or pressing R2 to put your axe through somebody's head, admittedly an incredibly satisfying mechanic. But even that limited interaction manages to feel fresh when it takes place on a new, impossibly beautiful piece of myth each time. It's a gorgeous game, breathtakingly so. Yet it wasn't the beauty that kept me coming back hour after hour through the very long and frankly repetitive story. The real heart of the game, and the part I think has the best chance of enduring, is the dialogue between Kratos and Atreus. I know, it's God of War, it's hard to imagine a series that's demonstrated less of a propensity for interesting characters or banner. Yet somehow, in spite of everything I just said about how dated and even ridiculous a character Kratos seems today, I managed to fall in love. Not necessarily with him, but with his relationship with his son. Don't get me wrong, it's a terrible father-son relationship built on lies and emotional instability, and Kratos' general lack of understanding or empathy or ability to express himself through anything but his fists. But no matter how tired I otherwise might have gotten with the core gameplay loop after 30 to 40 hours of playtime, I was always willing to scale another mountain, or hop back into that stupid canoe one more time just to hear these two goofballs chatter. Atreus does the improbable. He brings humanity to a series that's been entirely unconcerned with real human beings since the outset. He's an audience surrogate, and he's also a meta-commentary on the game itself. Channeling his mother, who's never seen or heard during the game, Atreus voices so many of the criticisms of Kratos as a manly ideal or adolescent power fantasy. He cuts right through that gruff facade and grim silence to reveal how empty that ideal is. When Kratos offhandedly makes a borderline sociopathic comment or threatens violence where none is necessary, it's Atreus who's the foil to all that, even as his father trains him to be an equally efficient killer. It's, in turns, touching and hilarious. Kratos' knock-knock jokes and memes took Twitter by storm for a reason. There's something genuinely endearing and frequently funny about the notion of this humorless, hyper-literal demigod dad dealing with the rigors of single parenthood, or slowly learning to become a real human being himself, while teaching his child how to rip the spleen out of a two-story hill troll. It's ridiculous. It's often self-contradicting. This game wants to have its violence is bad for your soul, kids, cake and eat it all at the same time. Yet somehow at the end of the day, it works. It's silly and poignant and adolescent and grown up about its contradictions all at the same time. Maybe that's just the power of good dialogue writing and great voice acting. Both those things do feel like rare gifts in video games. Stargate's Christopher Judge as the new voice of Kratos and the young Sonny Suljic as Atreus are wonderfully cast. God of War gives and gives with the banner, convincing you of these characters' solidity even at its flightiest moments. There aren't really any surprises. They grow and fail and push forward in exactly the ways you'd expect from this kind of story. But somehow by the end of the Odyssey I still wanted more, and despite spending a grueling number of hours on this game, I will gladly come back to hear more banter between these two when the inevitable DLC lands. So does that make the whole project worth it? God of War is a visually stunning, mechanically satisfying, self-commenting study of its own history. But in all of its endearing and entertaining dialogue, does it ever say anything meaningful about what the series represents and what makes it relevant in 2018? I'm still not really sure. I'm not convinced the game does grapple with the paradox of its extreme violence and its anti-violent narrative, not knowingly anyway. In some ways, like Kratos, it's reluctant to change. It knows on some level that Kratos' nihilism is toxic, that his stubbornness, his cynicism, his inability to communicate have serious consequences both on the world and on his child's psyche. The game is also reluctant to leave those attributes behind. It revels in the violence, after all. Tremendous care and skill was put into making Kratos' axe feel perfect in your hand, or rather, in the controller in your hand. Combat punctuates every encounter in the game. Every puzzle you solve, every new place you travel, every conversation you have that breaks some emotional ground. The game paces those encounters well. It gives them room to breathe and gives the player time to explore and gawk at the beauty of the world it reveals. Yet the brutality remains a constant, inescapable facet of the game nonetheless. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Violence in games can be fun. A lot of fun, even in God of War's case. But can a game so obsessed with its own violence ever effectively tell a story about moving past it? After this experience, I'm even less sure it's possible. Maybe as long as a game's core verb is attack, as long as it expresses its core ideas through killing, it can never have anything meaningful to say about it. God of War, at least, tries its very best. Maybe, like Atreus, it's not that I don't love this game. It's just that I need it to be better.